that this one spiritual practice can really shift us into all that. But in a way, it's easy to imagine that holding on to resentment and anger can keep us from that. I mean, that's kind of easy to imagine, that holding on to resentment and anger, frustrations, blame, can keep us from feeling that peace and that love. According to my Wikipedia, forgiveness is the renunciation or the cessation of resentment, indignation, or anger as a result of a perceived offense, a disagreement, or mistake. It's also said to be ceasing to demand punishment or restitution. And that's an interesting one. But what we get to remember through this talk is forgiveness is a choice. Sometimes, like with many other things, we think, I don't have a choice. I can't do it. But it is a choice, and it's a practice. It's a sacred practice. And it's often easier said than done. But when we stand in the truth of our being, just like we did in the beginning of that prayer, we activate forgiveness. And this allows us to see past events and circumstances with that perspective and clarity that brings wholeness into a situation that seemed anything but whole. And there's that shift happens when we're in that mode. And we can release anger and resentment in order to live in peace and joy and comfort. Forgiveness is ultimately that act of letting go of the ego's judgments, attachments, resistance, and reaction. So, Dietra, you will appreciate this. That's called the jar. I call it staying out of the jar. I used to talk about it all the time. Stay out of the jar. Judgments, attachments, resistance, and reactions. And when we're out of the jar, and it's true, like a jar, we're stuck in there with that. But where would you rather be? Out and free, feeling love and peace and joy. It is the state of unforgiving that keeps us from feeling unity in spirit, mind, and body. And as we grow in consciousness, forgiveness may come easier. And it may be that one boulder that is in the way of our path to wholeness, being unforgiving. So when we are talking about forgiving others, the way our understanding of consciousness or the wholeness of life is expanding is the same happens with our ideas and understanding and the need for forgiveness. We may need to practice forgiveness many times. Because our understanding of an event that happened to us changes and evolves. And we practice it until we only feel love and peace when we think of an event. When asked how many times must we forgive, Jesus answered 70 times 7. That's a lot of forgiving. We may need to forgive once. We may need to forgive many times. We have that idea, wait, I've done this before. I've forgiven before. I've gone through this before. And you can tell that you have to do it again because there's an anger that comes up with that. It's like, I don't want to forgive that person again. I already did that. But we're evolving and there are layers. And whenever we're bothered or disturbed by a thought, any belief, it's a signal to look at it, to explore it. And when we recall an event and still feel anger or resentment around it, we we don't want to sweep our emotions under the proverbial rug. We explore that anger. We explore the resentment. We acknowledge them, process them, and heal them. And one of the ways to do this is through forgiveness. And forgiveness restores that ability to see that big picture, to see the gifts in the painful events and wholeness in the fragments. Martin Luther King Jr. said, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Famously, he said, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And I think there's some very common misperceptions surrounding the art of forgiveness. One of the biggest things that most of us have is that someone doesn't deserve my forgiveness. The act of what they did, the situation, the circumstances, the events do not deserve my forgiveness. And we're playing judge and jury. You know, we're very responsible for all that's involved there. And that's a heavy burden. It's a heavy burden. But when we remember that forgiveness isn't condoning what someone has done, it is freeing ourselves from the ties that bind us to what they have done. We are letting go of attachment to what they've done. Forgiveness doesn't free them. We don't have that power to free anyone else. They are on their own life's journey. It frees us. Forgiveness will only free us. It allows us to experience our wholeness and oneness. But we don't experience that if we're bound to anger and resentment. We cannot serve two masters. So forgiveness frees us to be whole. Forgiving someone doesn't mean that we have to participate with them in any capacity. It doesn't mean that. Forgiveness doesn't mean that we fix a relationship or that we're obliged to participate. It is for us on our spiritual and personal journey in freedom. And as we forgive, here's what's cool. We discern what kind of relationship we will or won't have with that person or that event or that situation, but we also change and shift into a natural discernment into what is healthy for us now. In other words, we look for love and joy and peace in our relationships now, and we're not blocking it. We're not setting up walls and boundaries because of a past resentment or anger. We are loving and kind and compassionate, and we become stronger and clearer as to what our personal and interpersonal boundaries are. And as strange as it sounds, this is a good one. We don't need someone to be sorry for what they've done for us to forgive them. This is a tough one. We don't need them to be sorry because some people will never have that realization of the pain or the grief that they have instigated or the pain that they've caused. But they are bound by their actions in the same way that we are bound by ours. Our concern isn't really with their freedom or enlightenment, it's with our own. And when we will not forgive, we are planting that unforgiveness, anger, resentment into our soil. And we can expect to grow that, reap what we sow. In the same way that We can trust in the same law that they are reaping what they sow, whether we can see it or not. It has nothing to do with us. We forgive because we value our freedom, not because someone deserves it or doesn't deserve it. And I think it's important to remember that forgiving is not forgetting, like the old saying, forgive and forget. There's some things we will never, ever forget. But when we remember and relive a painful situation from this ego perspective, from our separate self, we empower that situation over and over again. We re-feel it in our bodies. We feel it like it's happening right now. The blood pressure rises, our hearts beat faster, our breath catches in our throat, stress and anxiety are pulsing through our mind, and toxins are released into our bloodstream now, right now. The event could have happened 10 years ago. But all that is happening now because we have not been able to step into forgiveness. When it brings this kind of pain and visceral reaction, the practice is called for. We want to release that. When we remember, when we recognize the situation from the state of forgiveness, that pain diminishes. And that natural state of harmony and clarity is there. Khalil Gibran said, I have learned silence from the talkative, tolerance from the intolerant, and kindness from the unkind. Yet strange, I am ungrateful to those teachers. Sometimes the people in our past, these past events, have brought us to new levels of understanding because we've been brought through pain, through suffering. And forgiveness brings about that shift in perspective that allows us to embrace all of our teachers. We let go of how the lesson came, and we rest in the gifts of a free spirit. Greater compassion, greater love, greater joy. And now that I've talked about forgiving others, we gotta mention forgiving ourselves. And in the same way that we are free when we forgive others, we can really only be free when we learn how to forgive ourselves. You know, shame and guilt are like, the cinder block walls that we've put up. And they keep us from that love, the same love and joy that is unforgiving towards others is the same lack that we feel when we have not forgiven ourselves. We may be the ones who have inflicted pain or suffering onto others when we lacked awareness or understanding, or when we reacted out of fear or from that sense of separation. When we forgive ourselves, the same rules apply. We're not condoning or justifying our behaviors or our shortcomings. We eventually have to accept full responsibility. We process those feelings. And hopefully we come to that place where we have that genuine sense of sorrow. You know, sorrow in Italian, the words for I am sorry is mi dispiace. It means I have displeased myself. I have displeased myself. I've done something to cause me sorrow, and therefore you sorrow. And it's that genuine regret for the pain that we may have caused others that, believe it or not, brings us into a greater sense of compassion, not just for ourselves, but for others. We know that we will never make that same choice that caused pain for someone else. because we've explored it. We dove into it. We didn't just bury it. Maya Angelou said, forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it. Only when we forgive ourselves are we able to take responsibility and really start that healing process. There's no blaming the other, blaming the circumstances, blaming our childhood, blaming all these things. We just look at what we do and the choices we made, the actions that resulted in hurting someone. It's hard to see ourselves as, you know, so immature or so angry or lost, whatever those things are. But guilt, actual healthy dose of guilt, invites us to examine the actions, what we didn't do, what we could have done, what we will do next time. And our choices open up, right? Again, that's that freedom we talk about, to know that we are not bound by the mistakes we've made, but we've grown, we've changed. We can allow that we did the best that we could, and we move into a new understanding, and that is freedom. And again, when we look at some of the things that I talked about earlier, it's like we can ask for forgiveness whether the person is living or not. In other words, we can ask for forgiveness without involving ourselves in that situation or relationship or not. We can do it in our heart of hearts, knowing that the love and the compassion that we feel for ourselves, we have put into the universe in this prayer of forgiveness. And deep responds unto deep. We don't need to be forgiven by others. Isn't that interesting? We may want to work towards that, but it isn't necessary for our spiritual growth, awareness, and understanding. Forgiving ourselves is necessary for our spiritual growth. We can't control what other people will hold on to on their journey. It is our responsibility to grow, to evolve, to change, and to love ourselves as much as we would love anyone. So then we know how to choose love, choose compassion, to heal and reveal that wholeness within us. And we recognize that we did the best we could. And that moves us into another category, which I call forgiving the unforgivable. Nelson Mandela said, as I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. What an incredible story of forgiving the unforgivable. When our story, our identity is wrapped up in trauma, you know, the ego really wants to continue the story, in effect, continue the drama. And it does this for a very important reason, so that we don't forget, so that it doesn't happen again, so that we stay on high alert and that we can stay safe. But we can clearly see the flaw in this ego-minded thinking. When we really live that trauma, we're doing what I said before, keeping the blood pressure high. We're reliving that experience, the toxins releasing into our bloodstream. But the ego thinks, I'm keeping us on high alert. We're staying safe. We'll never let this happen again. But when we relive that trauma and work so hard to stay safe, we work hard to be protected, those are the seeds we're planting into the soil. And what do we create? That feeling of not being safe, of not being able to protect ourselves, of being on continual high alert. And it keeps our body, mind, and emotions in that crisis mode again and again. We perpetuate that cycle of fear and pain. As we spiritually mature, we can see that the ego has done this out of that sense of separation for a reason, for a purpose. And then we come to that realization that that purpose no longer serves us. That now we can come from that place, that first stage of recognition and unification in that prayer that we did earlier. And from that place, we know peace and love and joy, and that is what we plant. And those are the seeds that we are sowing, and we will reap what we sow, joy and peace. We feel safe and protected because we feel whole and one. So this practice of forgiveness frees us from any cycles of pain, anger, resentment, and allows us to rest, feeling surrounded by peace. And sometimes we just start with that willingness. If there's a trauma in our life, we start with just the willingness to forgive. Believe it or not, the door is open. We don't have to say, I forgive. We just say, I'm willing to explore this process. And with forgiveness comes strength. You know, in fear, we think we're being strong. We think we're holding on to this. That's an ego thought of separation, though, because in wholeness, there is so much power. There is so much strength. And there is this the capacity for compassion. There's a quote, Mahatma Gandhi said, "The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is an attribute of the strong." When we know who we are as a spiritual being, we have the capacity to see the divine in ourselves, the divine in the other, and the divine in every situation and event and circumstance. We recognize the truth and the wholeness in life.